a Black Navy veteran, Marcus Bell, boarded his flight expecting nothing more than a smooth journey home. But what happened next would change everything. Seated comfortably in first class, Marcus held his ticket in hand, confident he was exactly where he belonged. Yet, just as the plane was preparing to taxi, a flight attendant approached, questioning his seat assignment. Despite showing his boarding pass, seat 38 clearly marked he was asked to move. Marcus stood his ground, calm but unyielding. Moments later, security arrived, escorting him off the plane as passengers watched in silence. But Marcus didn't stop there. Within 6 minutes, he had contacted the airline's corporate office, posted his experience online, and sparked a viral storm that would force the airline into crisis mode. By the end of the day, the CEO was issuing public apologies, and Marcus's story was being shared across the nation. How did one man's refusal to give up his seat ignite a movement for justice and accountability? Stay with me. This is a story of dignity, resilience, and the power of standing tall. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from. If stories like this resonate, don't forget to hit subscribe for more. The airport was a strange kind of quiet that afternoon, the kind that settles over people like a blanket they didn't ask for. Marcus Bell, standing at the gate with his boarding pass in hand, felt that quiet pressing down on him. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence before something breaks. Marcus had seen this kind of quiet before. Years ago, on the deck of a Navy ship in the middle of the Pacific. Right before the storm rolled in, and though he wasn't at sea anymore, that same heavy air followed him. Even here, just a man trying to make it home. The line to board was long, twisting like a serpent through the terminal. But Marcus waited patiently. It was the kind of patience life had taught him, slow, steady, and without expectation. His eyes traced the faces around him, and he saw it, the unspoken dance of glances. The way some people looked, then quickly looked away, as if his very presence was a reminder of something they wished they could forget. But Marcus wasn't here for all that. He was here for his seat, first class. Seat 3A. It was no gift. He had earned it, paid for it with money that didn't come easy, with years spent wearing the uniform of a country that often forgot to say thank you. The flight attendant greeted him with a polite nod as he entered the plane. Her smile was thin, perfunctory. Marcus nodded back, made his way to his seat, and settled in. The leather was cool against his skin, the kind of comfort money buys but doesn't always guarantee. The plane hummed with quiet conversations and the rustling of bags overhead. Outside, the sky was clear, a perfect blue stretching endlessly in every direction. Marcus leaned back and closed his eyes, letting himself exhale. And then, like a whisper that turns into a storm, it began. A shadow fell over him. Marcus opened his eyes to find the same flight attendant standing there, peering at his ticket as if it might rewrite itself if she stared long enough. "Sir," she began, with a voice that carried more weight than the word itself. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat." Marcus straightened slightly, holding up the ticket. "This is 3A, he replied, calm but firm. "It's my seat." A flicker of something passed over her face, doubt, hesitation, or maybe just annoyance, but it was there, and Marcus saw it as clear as day. "Could I see your ticket, please?" Marcus handed it over. She scanned it once, twice, as if she expected the numbers to shift under her gaze. "This seat is assigned to someone else," she said at last. Marcus's chest tightened. "No," he replied, shaking his head slightly. "It's not. I paid for this seat. It's right there in black and white." But her eyes had already left his. She was looking past him, waving over another flight attendant, who approached with the same rehearsed smile that never quite reached the eyes. The second attendant didn't bother asking questions. He leaned down, lowering his voice as if Marcus was the one causing a scene. "Sir, if you could just follow me. We can sort this out quickly." Marcus could feel it now, the shift in the air. The way eyes were beginning to land on him. People weren't listening to their own conversations anymore. They were listening to his. He didn't move. "There's nothing to sort out," Marcus said quietly. "I'm where I'm supposed to be." But they weren't listening to him. They were listening to each other, exchanging glances that said things their mouths wouldn't dare. Another figure appeared, the supervisor. His presence was heavy, his gaze impersonal. Marcus recognized the tone before he even spoke. "Sir," the supervisor began, his voice tight with forced politeness. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to ask you to leave the plane. There it was. Marcus felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. He could see the other passengers now, watching but pretending not to watch. Some wore expressions of discomfort, others curiosity. A few, the brave ones, showed something closer to guilt. But no one spoke up. No one ever did. Marcus considered his options. He could argue, but he knew how that would end. He could leave quietly, but the weight of it would follow him long after he stepped off the plane. Or he could stay right where he was. He didn't stand up. Call whoever you need to call, Marcus said, his voice steady as stone. I'm not moving. The plane felt smaller now, as if the very walls had begun to close in. The other passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen but hearing every word. Marcus could feel the tension like static in the air, buzzing, restless, ready to strike. But Marcus sat there, unmoving. His heart didn't race. He had seen worse storms. The supervisor's gaze hardened, and for a long moment, no one said a word. And then, the storm hit. The supervisor stood there, hands folded neatly in front of him as if politeness alone could smooth over the rising tension. Marcus could see it in the man's eyes, the quiet insistence of someone used to getting his way without raising his voice. There was something in the way he carried himself, the confidence of authority that didn't need justification. Marcus stayed seated. I've served this country, Marcus said evenly, his voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. I've been in combat zones, stationed on ships halfway across the world. And yet, here I am, fighting over a seat I paid for. The words hung there for a moment, heavier than either of them expected. Marcus wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. He wasn't the type, but he could feel it now, eyes shifting toward him. Stolen glances from across the aisle. The supervisor took a step closer, leaning in as if to shield the other passengers from hearing what came next. Mr. Bell, this isn't personal, he said with the polished ease of someone who'd said it before. Marcus looked up at him, and something in his gaze made the man hesitate. It's always personal, Marcus replied quietly. There it was, the crack beneath the surface. The truth most people would rather not see. This wasn't about a seat. It wasn't even about protocol. It was about something deeper. Something that stretched back further than either of them cared to admit. Marcus could feel the plane watching him now, the air itself growing thick with expectation. He could hear the rustle of newspapers folding, the soft shuffle of feet repositioning under chairs. No one said a word, but he felt their judgment as if they had. You know what this looks like, don't you? Marcus asked, not out of anger but out of exhaustion. The supervisor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The flight attendant, still lingering nearby, shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting nervously to the passengers who were now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Marcus scanned the rows of faces, some pretending to look past him, others too uncomfortable to hold his gaze. And in the silence, he felt the weight of their collective indifference pressing down on him like a stone. You can't just sit there, sir, the supervisor said, more forcefully now. The pretense of politeness was slipping, inch by inch. Marcus glanced down at the boarding pass still resting on his thigh. His name, his seat number, everything was there, plain as day. Yet somehow, it wasn't enough. How many times have you done this? Marcus asked, lifting his gaze. His voice was calm, steady, but his eyes burned with something harder to ignore. The supervisor hesitated. For the first time, Marcus saw doubt flicker across his face. Mr. Bell, the supervisor began, but Marcus cut him off. How many times have you asked someone like me to move when they weren't supposed to? Marcus pressed, his voice rising slightly. How many times has someone else sat here, someone who looked different? Someone who didn't make you think twice? The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deafening. Sir, we're asking you to leave the plane, the supervisor said finally, his voice sharper than before. Marcus's grip tightened on the armrest, his knuckles pressing against the cool leather. No, Marcus replied. It wasn't loud, it wasn't defiant, it was a simple refusal. And yet it rang out like thunder. The supervisor stepped back as if the word itself had weight. And for a moment, Marcus thought he saw something else in the man's face, something closer to fear. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats. A woman in the front row glanced at Marcus with something like sympathy. But she didn't speak. No one ever did. Marcus thought about all the times he had let things like this slide. The small slides. The subtle humiliations, moments no one else seemed to notice but that left bruises beneath the surface. Invisible to the naked eye. Not today. I paid for this seat, Marcus said, louder this time. And unless there's a real reason for me to move, I'm not going anywhere. The flight attendant, sensing the shift in the air, took a step back. Her eyes darted to the supervisor. But he didn't meet her gaze. Marcus could feel the weight of their indecision, the push and pull of authority and doubt. He saw it for what it was, the hesitation of men and women who had never been challenged like this. And in that moment, Marcus realized something. It wasn't just the seat they wanted to take from him. It was his right to occupy that space without question. The supervisor, face reddening with quiet frustration, reached for his radio. Security, he said, his voice clipped and efficient. Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back in his seat. He wasn't surprised. Outside, the sky remained calm and blue. Indifferent to the storm building inside the plane, Marcus Bell could hear the footsteps before he saw them. They were slow at first, measured, deliberate, heavy soles pressing against thin airport carpet. A small group moving as one, like officers approaching a man who already knew his sentence. Marcus kept his eyes forward, but he felt them closing in behind him. The other passengers felt it too. Conversations dulled to whispers, and the faint clinking of glasses from the galley faded into silence. The aisle seemed to shrink as two uniformed airport security officers appeared. One slightly ahead of the other. Their posture was firm, professional, but there was something in the way they carried themselves, a stiffness that betrayed the tension beneath the surface. "Mr. Bell," one of the officers said, his voice calm in the way a storm looks calm right before the wind howls. "We're going to need you to step off the plane." Marcus didn't look at them right away. Instead, his eyes traveled to the faces of the passengers around him. A woman in row 4 shifted in her seat, her gaze fixed firmly on her hands as if she could will herself invisible. A businessman adjusted his tie, pretending to study his laptop, though the screen had gone black. No one would look him in the eye. Marcus exhaled slowly and turned to face the officers. "Can you tell me why?" he asked. His voice even. One officer, older, with graying hair at the temples, opened his mouth to speak. But the other, younger and eager to assert his authority, stepped forward first. "There's been a seating issue," the younger one said. "The crew's asked for your cooperation." Marcus held up his ticket, the edges slightly worn from where his thumb had pressed into it. "My seat's right here," Marcus replied, his voice louder now, filling the small space between him and the officers. "I'm not in the wrong seat." The older officer glanced at the ticket but didn't take it. His eyes flicked to the supervisor standing off to the side, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable but firm. Marcus could feel it tightening now, the walls of invisible expectation closing around him. He had seen this moment before, though in different forms. In job interviews where he was told he was overqualified. In department stores where his presence drew the subtle attention of security guards. In neighborhoods where unfamiliar faces watched him a little too closely, their eyes asking questions their lips never dared to. It was the same story, retold 1,000 different ways. And yet, it still felt like betrayal. "You served, didn't you?" the older officer asked suddenly, his eyes lingering on the small navy pin still clipped to Marcus's bag. "I did," Marcus answered. 15 years. There was a pause. A flicker of something almost like recognition passed over the older man's face, a brief understanding between two men who had worn the same uniform, who had known the same sacrifices. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Then you know how this works," the officer said softly. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus felt the weight of the words sink in. Harder for who? He wanted to ask, but he already knew the answer. The plane's engines hummed softly beneath them. A reminder that this was supposed to be simple. A flight home. A seat in first class. Nothing more. Yet, here he was. Marcus gripped the armrests, the smooth leather cool beneath his fingers. He thought of his father, how he had once told Marcus, "A man's dignity isn't something you give away just because someone asks for it." His father had been a quiet man, but his words, much like Marcus's own, carried weight. "Sir, I need you to stand up," the younger officer said again, impatience creeping into his tone. Marcus's heart began to pound, not out of fear, but out of something else. Something closer to defiance. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as if each inch he lifted off that seat was a protest unto itself. As Marcus stood, the plane seemed to shrink even further. His head brushed the overhead compartment. And for a moment, he loomed over the officers in front of him. The passengers shifted, eyes flicking nervously toward the window or their folded newspapers. Marcus took one last look at the seat behind him. "This isn't over," he said softly, not to the officers, but to the space itself, to the air that seemed to hum with something left unresolved. The older officer nodded, perhaps sensing the truth in Marcus's words. As Marcus stepped into the aisle, he felt the pull of every gaze on him. There was no applause, no murmured words of support, only silence, the kind that follows when everyone in the room knows something wrong has just happened. But no one has the courage to say so. The supervisor watched from the front of the plane, his eyes steady, but Marcus saw through the mask. He wasn't being removed for a seat mix-up. They all knew that. He was being removed because the space Marcus occupied made others uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with assigned seating. And the weight of that truth followed him all the way down the jet bridge, each step echoing louder than the last. Marcus Bell could hear the wheels of his carry-on tremble against the smooth floor as he walked down the jet bridge, each step heavy with the weight of something unspoken yet undeniable. The doors to the terminal slid open, and Marcus emerged into the waiting area, greeted by the indifferent eyes of travelers sipping coffee, scrolling through their phones, or huddled in small clusters, lost in quiet conversations. To them, he was just another passenger stepping off a plane, just another body moving through the endless current of departures and arrivals. But Marcus felt different. He felt the sting of displacement, the quiet humiliation that comes when a man is forced to shrink himself, not because he was wrong, but because someone else decided he didn't belong. A flight crew member passed by without so much as a glance in his direction. For them, it was over. But for Marcus, the injustice still lingered in the air, like smoke long after the fire had been extinguished. He stood still, rooted to the spot just beyond the gate. It wasn't just the seat. It was the memory of 1,000 other moments just like this, smaller, quieter, less noticeable perhaps, but each one chiseling away at him, carving him into someone who had learned to live with less space, less comfort, less regard. Marcus's hand tightened around the handle of his bag. For a moment, he considered walking to the airline's customer service desk, demanding to speak to someone higher up. But he already knew how that conversation would end, with apologies that felt like bandages over wounds that hadn't been treated, with tired explanations about protocol and misunderstandings. He could see it now, the gentle nods, the promises to investigate the matter, the thinly veiled hope that he would simply take his voucher, his refund, and disappear. Marcus had no interest in disappearing. A voice over the intercom announced a final boarding call for another flight. And as Marcus looked up, he saw 2 airline employees standing near the desk at the adjacent gate. One of them was the flight attendant who had confronted him earlier. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments. She looked away. Marcus felt something rise in his chest, not rage, not quite, but something just beneath it, simmering, pulsing with every beat of his heart. He turned, walking with purpose toward the nearest customer service kiosk. A young woman with bright eyes and a mechanical smile greeted him. "Hi there, how can I help you today?" Marcus placed his ticket on the counter with a calmness that betrayed the storm brewing beneath his skin. "I was just removed from my flight," he said. "I'd like to speak to someone about why." The woman's smile faltered. She glanced down at the ticket, then back at Marcus, her eyes flickering with the kind of discomfort people wear when they don't know how to handle what's in front of them. "Let me check something for you," she said, typing furiously into the computer as if the keyboard might save her from having to deal with him directly. Marcus watched the reflection of the screen in her glasses, the glow of customer logs and seating charts flashing too quickly for her to absorb. Finally, she looked up. "It looks like there was a mix-up with the seating assignment," she said carefully. "I'm really sorry about that. We can offer you a seat on the next available flight. Or if you prefer, we can provide compensation." Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "I don't want compensation," he interrupted. "I want to know why I was asked to leave a seat I paid for." The woman shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, sir," she said, lowering her voice as if acknowledging the discomfort might make it easier to bear. I'm just following what's in the system. I can escalate this to a supervisor if you'd like. Marcus exhaled through his nose, forcing the heat in his chest to settle. Please do. She picked up the phone, her fingers drumming nervously against the counter as she waited for someone to answer. Marcus felt the eyes again, the occasional glance from travelers passing by. The half-curious, half-cautious stares that seemed to cling to him wherever he went. A few minutes later, a man in a navy blue blazer appeared from behind a glass door near the counter. He looked polished, the kind of corporate face trained to manage problems before they spiraled. Mr. Bell, he greeted, offering his hand. I'm David. I understand there was an issue with your flight. Marcus shook his hand firmly but said nothing, letting the silence speak for him. David motioned for Marcus to follow him into a small, private seating area. The glass walls offered just enough privacy to keep their conversation discreet, but not enough to shield Marcus from the stares still lingering outside. Mr. Bell, I apologize for the inconvenience. David began, folding his hands over his knee. From what I understand, there was a misunderstanding regarding your seat. I want to assure you it wasn't personal. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. It always feels personal when I'm the only one being asked to move, he replied. David shifted in his chair, clearly caught off guard by the bluntness of Marcus's words. I understand why you feel that way, David said, and I want you to know we take these matters seriously. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady and unflinching. Do you? He asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you take them seriously now when I'm standing in front of you. But where was that concern when I was on the plane? David opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. You see, I've lived long enough to know how this works. Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum. You'll apologize, maybe offer me a voucher or a discount on my next flight. But nothing changes. The next time someone like me sits in first class, the same thing will happen. And the time after that. And the time after that. David's gaze dropped slightly, as if he couldn't bear the weight of Marcus's words. This isn't just about a seat, Marcus said softly. It's about the way we're seen. Or not seen at all. For the first time since Marcus stepped into that terminal, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt full, heavy with the truths Marcus had carried for years, now laid bare for someone else to hold, even if just for a moment. David nodded slowly. I hear you, he said, and I promise you we'll look into this. Marcus stood, gathering his bag. I hope you do, he replied, turning toward the glass doors. Because I'll be watching. Marcus Bell walked away from the glass-walled office with the polite echoes of David's apology trailing behind him. But the words dissolved before they reached his ears. The terminal was the same as he had left it, bright, clean, humming with the ordinary rhythms of life. Travelers moved with the effortless ease of people who assumed they belonged, unaware of the man standing among them who had just been reminded. Once again, that belonging was not guaranteed. Marcus's steps slowed as he approached the row of chairs by the gate. His legs ached not from walking, but from the weight of something far heavier than his carry-on. He sat down, letting his back sink into the cold, plastic seat, and gazed at the flight information flickering on the monitors overhead. Numbers and destinations blinked in rapid succession. Impersonal and indifferent. But Marcus wasn't going anywhere. The chair beneath him felt different now. It wasn't the seat they had taken from him in first class. But it carried the same weight, the weight of knowing that no matter how much space he claimed, there would always be invisible hands ready to pull it away. The thought pressed against him, cold and relentless. Across the waiting area, Marcus saw two men in airline uniforms talking quietly. One of them gestured in his direction, and Marcus felt the low thrum of something electric ripple through his chest. It was subtle, but he had learned to recognize it, the way people spoke about him without ever meeting his eyes. The way his presence carried weight they wished they could shake off. Marcus looked away, pressing his hands together to steady himself. It would be easy to let it slide, to let this moment drift into the pile of others he had buried before. After all, that's what they wanted, for him to let go, for him to fold into himself, smaller and smaller until he disappeared altogether. But something in Marcus refused to yield. He wasn't just carrying the weight of this moment. He was carrying the weight of his father, his uncles, and the men who had come before them, the ones who taught him. Through quiet sacrifices, that dignity is not surrendered without a fight. Marcus's father had been a proud man. A man who could fix anything. From broken radios to broken hearts. But never once asked for recognition. Marcus remembered the way his father's voice carried through their small house. Steady even when the world outside pressed against him like a vice. You don't walk away just because someone tells you to. His father used to say. You stand, even when your legs shake. Marcus's legs weren't shaking now. He rose from his seat with the calm of a man who had already made up his mind. Marcus wasn't leaving. He approached the counter, his footsteps soft but deliberate. The young woman at the desk, Laura, according to the silver pin glinting on her blouse, glanced up with a nervous smile. Mr. Bell, she said quickly, straightening in her chair. I spoke with my manager. And we're working to get you rebooked. I can assure you. Marcus raised his hand, and the words fell away. I'd like to file a formal complaint, he said, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. Laura blinked, clearly surprised by the request. Of course, she replied, fumbling for a clipboard beneath the desk. I can help you with that. She placed the form in front of him. But Marcus didn't reach for it. I want to speak to someone directly, he said, his eyes not leaving hers. Not a form, not a hotline, a person. Laura hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if hoping someone else might step in. But no one did. Mr. Bell, she began softly, lowering her voice to something that felt dangerously close to pity. I understand you're upset. I really do. But the best thing I can do right now is help you get on another flight. I'm not looking for another flight. Marcus interrupted. I'm looking for accountability. The word hung between them, sharper than either of them expected. Laura opened her mouth to respond. But Marcus leaned in slightly, his gaze unyielding. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, he continued. Not to me, and not to people who look like me. And I'm tired of letting it slide. So I'll wait, right here, until someone who can answer for this comes to talk to me. Laura stared at him for a long moment, torn between empathy and the quiet desperation of someone who wanted nothing more than for the problem to disappear. But Marcus wasn't disappearing. Finally, she nodded. I'll get my supervisor, she said quietly, disappearing behind the door marked, employees only. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle into his bones like an old companion. He turned back toward the waiting area. And this time, he noticed the stairs. A man in a business suit watched from the corner of the room, his eyes darting away the second Marcus met his gaze. A woman holding a small child whispered something to the man beside her, both of them glancing in his direction but saying nothing loud enough to be heard. Marcus knew this performance well. He had lived it too many times to count the silent courtroom where judgments were passed without a word, where verdicts were etched not in legal documents but in the shifting glances of those too afraid to confront their own discomfort. But Marcus wasn't performing for them. He was standing for himself. The sound of footsteps echoed once more. Heavier this time. David returned, his face tighter than before. Mr. Bell, David began, but Marcus held up a hand. No more apologies, Marcus said. No more empty words. I want to know what you're going to do about it. David's lips tightened into a thin line. But for the first time, Marcus saw something that almost resembled respect. Follow me, David said. Marcus nodded, his chest rising with the quiet certainty that, this time, he wouldn't be the one to move. Marcus Bell followed David through the terminal, his steps steady but the fire beneath them growing hotter with each passing second. The corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with glass that caught the reflection of Marcus's broad shoulders and the stiffness in David's posture. The sound of their footsteps filled the empty space between them, a hollow echo that made Marcus feel like they were the only two men left in the world. David led him to a small office tucked away near the corner of the terminal. It wasn't much: 2 chairs, a plain desk, and a view of the tarmac where planes taxied and lifted into the sky. Unbothered by the storms that swirled inside, Marcus stepped in first, lowering himself into one of the chairs. He didn't slump, didn't let the weight of the moment pull him down. His back was straight, his chin level. There was something to be said for the posture of a man who had long since decided he would not bend. David closed the door quietly, as if the soft click of the latch could somehow keep the outside world from listening in. Mr. Bell, David began, sitting across from him. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him. But he said nothing. David cleared his throat and folded his hands neatly on the desk. His wedding ring glinted beneath the pale fluorescent light. "I want to start by apologizing again for what happened," David said, his voice calm, measured, each word placed carefully, like stones trying to pave over a widening crack. Marcus let the silence stretch. There was a certain power in silence. It forced people to sit with their own discomfort, to fumble for something to fill the emptiness. David shifted slightly in his chair. "It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome," he continued. "I've spoken to the crew involved, and I can assure you that." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I'm going to stop you right there," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You're not here because I felt unwelcome. You're here because I was removed from that plane for no reason other than the fact that someone decided I didn't belong in the seat I paid for." David's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't about intentions," Marcus said, his voice rising just enough to fill the small office. "It's about patterns. It's about the fact that I've lived long enough to know exactly what happened back there. And so have you." David lowered his eyes for a brief moment. But Marcus caught at the flicker of recognition, the quiet admission that this was not unfamiliar territory. "I know you have a job to do," Marcus continued, his tone softening but losing none of its edge. "And I know this isn't the first time you've had to sit across from someone like me and try to explain something that doesn't have an explanation." David let out a slow breath, his hands tightening slightly around each other. "You're right," David admitted, his voice quieter now. "I have had this conversation before." Marcus leaned back in his chair, allowing David's words to linger in the space between them. "It's not the crew," Marcus said finally. "It's the system. It's the way people like me are watched just a little closer, questioned just a little faster, doubted just a little more." David nodded faintly, though the weight of his agreement seemed reluctant. "I'm not asking you to fix the system," Marcus said, his voice cooling to something almost reflective. "I know that's not how this works. But I'm asking you to see it, to name it for what it is." David's eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time, there was something genuine beneath his polished exterior, a flicker of shame, perhaps, or the quiet acknowledgement of truths too long ignored. "I see it," David said softly, "and I won't pretend I don't." Marcus sat with that for a moment, letting the tension loosen just slightly. But it wasn't gone, because Marcus knew that seeing the problem wasn't the same as solving it. David's sincerity, no matter how real, would not stop the next black man from being told his seat was no longer his. "What happens next?" Marcus asked, his tone sharpening once more. David straightened. "I'll escalate this," he said quickly, as if the rehearsed answer had been waiting just beneath the surface. "We'll open an internal investigation. I can assure you, the employees involved will be retrained." Marcus's laugh, low and dry, cut him off. "Retrained?" Marcus repeated. "Come on now, David. We both know this doesn't get fixed in a training room." David hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Marcus shook his head. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice calm but unrelenting. "You're going to refund my ticket. You're going to make sure the people who made that call know exactly why it was wrong. And then you're going to take this hire not because it's protocol, but because this can't keep happening." David's brow furrowed. "I understand," he said, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed the lingering doubt. Marcus stood slowly, gathering his bag. "Do you?" Marcus asked, meeting David's eyes one last time. "Because if you did, we wouldn't be sitting here." David rose as well, but he didn't speak. Marcus opened the office door, the rush of terminal noise flooding in like a reminder that the world outside hadn't changed. "Not yet." Marcus paused at the threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. "You can't fix it all," Marcus said, "but you can stop pretending it's not there." David's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought he might respond. But the words never came. Marcus stepped back into the terminal, his footsteps swallowed by the endless hum of the crowd. Marcus Bell didn't make it far before the terminal seemed to stretch around him. The ceiling rising higher, the crowds moving slower. His feet carried him toward a row of windows overlooking the tarmac. But his mind drifted elsewhere to places he had long tried to leave behind. The streets of his childhood, where shopkeepers followed him with their eyes but never their smiles. The department stores, where security guards lingered just a breath too close. The classrooms, where teachers praised his intelligence but questioned the source of it, as if brilliance could not grow in brown skin. It was all there, packed tightly beneath his ribs. Marcus leaned against the glass, staring at the planes cutting across the sky, each one carrying people to places where they would never think twice about their right to sit, to stand, to simply exist. The reflection staring back at him in the window was familiar, but the weight in his chest was heavier now. It wasn't just his. It belonged to every man and woman he had ever known who had swallowed their pride and called it survival. He could hear the faint hum of a woman's voice behind him, soft but urgent. "Excuse me, sir?" Marcus turned to find an older woman standing nearby, a small child clutching the edge of her coat. She hesitated when their eyes met, but there was no fear in her gaze, only something Marcus couldn't quite place. "I saw what happened," she said, glancing toward the gate Marcus had been removed from. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened to you." Marcus nodded faintly, the weight of her words settling into him like stones sinking in water. "Thank you," he said quietly. The woman lingered for a moment longer, as if wanting to say more but unsure if it would matter. Finally, she knelt down to adjust the child's jacket. Marcus watched them disappear into the crowd, the child skipping along without a care in the world. He wondered if the boy would remember this moment. If one day, long after the woman's hair turned silver and her hands grew frail, the boy would think back to this day and understand what his grandmother had tried to teach him. Marcus hoped so, but hope, he knew, was a fragile thing. Across the terminal, Marcus noticed a man watching him, a heavy-set figure in a worn baseball cap. The man looked away quickly, pretending to fiddle with the strap of his duffel bag. But Marcus had seen the look. It wasn't curiosity. It was guilt, the kind of guilt that grows in the quiet spaces between action and inaction. Marcus pushed away from the window, making his way toward the baggage claim. But the man's voice stopped him. "Hey," the man called out, his tone awkward, almost apologetic. Marcus turned slowly, and the man scratched the back of his neck. "I was on that flight," the man said. "I saw what they did." Marcus didn't respond. "I should have said something," the man added, shifting his weight. "I thought about it, but," his voice trailed off, as if the words couldn't find a place to land. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The man's shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight he carried. The weight Marcus recognized because it wasn't unfamiliar. "We all think about it," Marcus said, his voice low. "That's the problem." The man's face twisted in something like shame. "Yeah," he muttered, nodding slowly. "You're right." There was no more to say. Marcus turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps folding into the low murmur of the terminal. But as he passed the crowd, he could feel it, the shift in the air, the quiet recognition rippling beneath the surface. He hadn't spoken loudly. He hadn't raised his fists or shouted his anger to the heavens. And yet, the room carried his name. Because even when men like Marcus moved in silence, the world could hear them. And that, Marcus knew, was something they could never take away. Marcus Bell stood at the edge of the baggage claim, watching the carousel spin like a wheel that never quite stopped. He wasn't sure how long he'd been standing there. Minutes, maybe. Time seemed to stretch in these moments, the kind where the body is present, but the mind drifts elsewhere, lingering in the spaces left behind by wounds no one sees. Suitcases tumbled down the conveyor, passengers crowding the belt, their hands darting out to claim their belongings with ease. Without thought, Marcus waited, but his bag never appeared. It felt fitting somehow. One more thing misplaced, delayed, or dismissed. Behind him, the terminal's hum persisted, the voices of travelers blending into a low, constant murmur. Marcus could hear fragments of conversations, the woman asking about hotel shuttles, the couple arguing over directions, the child tugging impatiently at his father's sleeve. Life went on around him, as if nothing had happened. As if men like Marcus weren't asked to carry things that never quite fit into overhead compartments. His eyes narrowed slightly as the final suitcase disappeared from the belt. Marcus stepped forward, resting his palms against the cool metal edge, letting the cold bleed into his skin. He saw the agent at the counter, the one tasked with the tedious duty of handling lost luggage. She didn't look up as Marcus approached. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice even but firm. The woman glanced up, blinking behind her glasses. "Yes?" My bag didn't come through, Marcus replied. She nodded mechanically and reached for a clipboard. Flipping to the next blank page. Can I have your ticket, please? Marcus handed it to her, watching as she typed with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same thing 100 times a day. What does the bag look like? She asked. Black, with a navy emblem on the side. Her fingers hesitated briefly over the keyboard. She didn't look at him directly. But Marcus saw the flicker of recognition as the words registered. Navy. Veteran. Okay, she said, glancing at the screen. It may have been placed on the wrong carousel. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes. Marcus knew better. He had traveled enough to know the difference between accidents and patterns. But he let it slide for now. She scribbled down the claim number and handed it to him. If we find it, we'll call you, she said, already turning to the next person in line. Marcus folded the slip into his pocket, stepping back into the sea of travelers drifting toward the exits. His phone buzzed. He pulled it from his jacket, glancing at the screen. David, airline manager, I've spoken to corporate. They'll be reaching out. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words. And it wouldn't be the last. But Marcus knew something David didn't. He wasn't the same man who had walked onto that plane hours ago, hoping for a quiet flight home. The Marcus who left the airport was heavier now, not because of what had happened, but because of the long, slow erosion that came from carrying too much for too long. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket and stepped outside into the fading light. The sky stretched wide above him, tinged with the soft pinks and blues of early evening. But Marcus didn't notice. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on the road ahead. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the quiet simmer of frustration and exhaustion, Marcus felt something else rise. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. Because Marcus Bell knew that silence was not the absence of sound. It was the space where change began. Marcus Bell sat in the backseat of the taxi, the city rolling by in the window like the reels of an old film, familiar but distant, flickering at the edges of memory. The hum of tires against pavement was soft, almost soothing, but Marcus's mind refused to settle. The phone buzzed again in his pocket. He didn't need to look at it to know who it was. David, corporate. Another soft-voiced apology waiting to be read, wrapped in polite words that did nothing to mend the tear in Marcus's spirit. He ignored it. The light ahead turned red, and the taxi slowed to a stop. Marcus's reflection stared back at him in the glass, his face shadowed by the city lights beyond the window. He studied the lines at the corners of his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. Somewhere in those features was the boy he used to be, the boy who had once believed that if he walked the line carefully enough, if he wore the right clothes and spoke the right way, he would be spared this particular kind of battle. But Marcus had learned long ago that no suit, no medal, no title could shield him from the weight of his skin. The driver, an older man with salt and pepper hair, glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. His eyes lingered for just a moment too long. You all right back there? The man asked. Marcus nodded, though the answer felt hollow. Long day, Marcus replied. The driver chuckled softly. Ain't they all? The light turned green, and the taxi lurched forward, merging back into the flow of traffic. Marcus thought about David's message again. I've spoken to corporate. What did that mean? Really? Marcus had heard those words before, and he knew that behind the veneer of concern lay something colder, an unspoken hope that the problem would fade quietly, like rain dissolving into the asphalt. But Marcus wasn't in the mood to disappear. His father used to tell him, "You've got to hold on to your name, son. It's the only thing this world can't take from you unless you hand it over." Marcus pressed his thumb against the side of his phone. Unlocking it, the screen lit up, and for a long moment, he simply stared at David's message. Then, without thinking, Marcus opened the camera. He took a photo of his boarding pass, the one that clearly showed his name and seat number. He attached it to a new message, one not directed at David or corporate, but at something bigger. Marcus's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the words forming slowly but surely. I paid for seat 3A. I was removed anyway. He hesitated for only a moment before adding more. They saw my seat, but not me. Marcus hit send, watching as his words rippled out into the digital ether. Within seconds, the first notification appeared. A like, a comment, then another, and another. By the time Marcus arrived at his doorstep, The phone in his pocket felt heavier, alive with the weight of strangers who had seen his words and understood them as their own. Marcus stood outside his apartment, watching the notifications roll in. One message, brief and cutting, caught his attention. "Same thing happened to me. First class, but not first in line." Marcus exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the phone. This wasn't new, it wasn't rare, but it didn't have to be quiet. The next morning, Marcus's words were no longer just his own. They were in the mouths of anchors on morning news shows, echoed in the voices of veterans who saw themselves in his story, repeated by strangers who whispered to their children, "Look at this. This could be us." By midday, Marcus's phone rang. David's name flashed across the screen. Marcus let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Bell," David began, his voice thinner, stretched taut beneath the weight of headlines. "I wanted to follow up. The company has decided to issue a public statement. We deeply regret." Marcus cut him off. "You regret the attention," Marcus said, his voice low, "not the act." David paused on the other end. "I understand why you feel that way," David replied carefully, "but we are taking this seriously. I assure you, changes will be made. Our staff is being retrained, and we are working with diversity officers to ensure this doesn't happen again." Marcus leaned back against his chair, letting the words wash over him. He had heard it all before. "Tell me something, David," Marcus said after a long silence. "How many times do you think someone has said that same sentence to a black man in the last 50 years? David didn't respond immediately. Marcus didn't need him to. The answer wasn't in the words, it was in the pauses, the things that lingered unsaid. Finally, David spoke. "I can't change the past," he said softly, "but I can make sure your voice is heard now." Marcus smiled faintly, though there was little humor in it. "My voice has always been loud enough," Marcus replied. "It's the listening that takes work." There was nothing left to say after that. As Marcus ended the call, his eyes drifted toward the window, the city stretching endlessly beneath the afternoon sun. His father's words echoed once more in his mind. "You've got to hold on to your name." And Marcus Bell intended to do just that. Marcus Bell woke early, long before the city stirred. The weight of something unfinished pressed against him, as if the day ahead already carried more than its share of battles. The sun hadn't yet crept over the skyline, but the glow of his phone screen filled the room like a distant lighthouse. Messages, emails, news alerts, each one stacking atop the other in a digital storm. Marcus scrolled through them slowly. His story had grown legs overnight. The post he had written, the one where he simply stated the facts. Nothing more, nothing less, had reached further than he ever intended. A local news station had picked it up, then a national outlet, and now, somewhere between the quiet of that early morning and the dawn rising beyond his window, Marcus Bell was no longer just Marcus Bell. He was the veteran removed from first class. A symbol. Marcus had no interest in being a symbol. Symbols were useful to the world in a way that men rarely were. And when the moment passed, when the headlines faded, symbols were left behind, forgotten, discarded, like statues in empty parks. But Marcus didn't have the luxury of forgetting. His phone rang just as the first light broke through the blinds. David's name again. Marcus let it ring. He wasn't ready for David. Not yet. Instead, Marcus rose from the bed and stepped out onto his small balcony, breathing in the cool morning air. The city was waking up below him, cars threading through intersections, the distant hum of construction work, the faint music of a street vendor setting up for the day. All of it ordinary, all of it continuing, as if the world had no memory. Marcus wondered if that was the point, if the world survived by pretending that nothing had happened. But Marcus wasn't interested in pretending. His phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a text. "David, airline manager, the CEO wants to meet today, in person." Marcus stared at the message for a long while. A meeting. Not a phone call. Not an email. A meeting. Marcus wasn't naive. He understood exactly what this was. The fire had grown too big. And now, they wanted to pour water over it before it spread further. But Marcus wasn't a fire they could put out. He typed his response without hesitation. "Marcus, I'll be there." The airline's headquarters sat like a glass monolith, its reflective surface mirroring the sky in every direction. Marcus stood outside the entrance, adjusting the collar of his jacket as the security guard buzzed him through. David was waiting in the lobby. A little too eager. His handshake a little too tight. "Marcus, thank you for coming," David said, as if Marcus had done him a favor by showing up. Marcus said nothing, following David through the sleek, pristine hallways. When they reached the conference room, the CEO was already seated, a cup of coffee steaming at his side. "Mr. Bell," the CEO greeted, rising from his chair and extending his hand. "Thank you for taking the time." Marcus shook his hand, firm but brief, and took the seat across from him. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The CEO folded his hands, leaning slightly forward. "Let me begin by saying how deeply sorry I am for the incident on your flight," he started, his tone carefully measured. "I've read the reports. I saw your post. This is unacceptable, and I want you to know we are addressing it directly." Marcus met his gaze but didn't speak. "I assure you," the CEO continued, "we've already begun retraining our staff to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. Our team is committed to making real changes." Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely over his chest. "You think this is about training?" Marcus asked quietly. The CEO blinked, caught off guard by the calmness of Marcus's voice. "This isn't about someone needing another seminar on diversity," Marcus said, his tone hardening. "This is about the fact that I could have shown that ticket to 10 different people, and 9 of them still would have questioned whether I belonged in that seat." The CEO's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "We understand the broader implications," he replied, "and I want you to know that we value your voice in this. That's why I wanted to meet personally." Marcus let out a slow breath. "I'm not here for your apology," Marcus said plainly. "I'm here because this isn't just about me. It's about every other black man who steps onto one of your planes and wonders if this time someone's going to decide he doesn't belong." David shifted uncomfortably beside the CEO. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen men like you my whole life," Marcus said, his voice growing sharper. "Good men. Men who say the right things in meetings like this. But when the doors close, and the cameras aren't rolling, nothing changes." The CEO opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I'm not asking for vouchers. I don't need free miles," Marcus said, his voice like iron. "I need to know that the next man doesn't have to sit in that seat and wonder if he'll make it to his destination or be escorted off the plane like he's trespassing." Silence filled the room. The CEO glanced at David, but there was no answer to be found. Finally, Marcus leaned forward, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You want to make this right?" Marcus asked. "Then don't do it because I'm sitting here. Do it because it's the right thing to do, even when nobody's watching." The CEO nodded slowly, as if the weight of Marcus's words pressed down on him for the first time. "We'll make this right," the CEO said softly. Marcus rose from his chair, straightening his jacket. "I'll believe it when I see it," he replied. And with that, Marcus walked out of the room, his name intact, his silence broken, and the fire still burning in his chest. Marcus Bell stepped out of the airline's headquarters and into the glare of the afternoon sun. But the warmth did nothing to shake the cold that had settled deep in his chest. The city sprawled in front of him, glass towers reflecting light that did not belong to them. Streets crowded with people who moved as if the ground beneath them had never once trembled. Marcus moved with purpose, but he felt it in his bones, the lingering heaviness that follows a man after he has told the truth in rooms where truth was not expected to be spoken aloud. As he walked, his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, vibrating like an unsteady heart. News outlets were calling, journalists were reaching out, strangers, men and women he had never met, were flooding his inbox with stories of their own. He stopped at the corner, pulling the phone from his jacket. A new message. Unknown number. "Mr. Bell, I was on your flight. I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. He had heard variations of this confession more times than he could count. It came in whispers after protests, in polite apologies from neighbors, in the quiet regret of coworkers who stood by when standing up would have cost them nothing. "I should have said something." It was the anthem of people who watched injustice from the safety of distance, close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid the flames. Marcus typed out a brief reply. "Marcus, thank you for your message." And that was all. He could not teach them how to carry what they had refused to bear. By the time Marcus reached his apartment, The day had already begun to slip into evening. He sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the room pressing down on him like a second skin. The television hummed quietly in the corner, the news anchor's voice filling the space with words Marcus had grown weary of hearing. The airline has since issued a public apology to Marcus Bell, a Navy veteran who was removed from first class on what officials are calling a misunderstanding. The company has vowed to review internal policies and provide additional training to ensure such incidents do not occur again. Marcus muted the television, staring at the black screen. There it was, the familiar pattern. The apology, the statement, the promises. But Marcus knew better than to mistake a ripple for a wave. He reached for his laptop and opened the draft he had begun the night before. The cursor blinked against the empty screen, waiting for him to shape the thing that had taken root inside of him. Marcus wasn't interested in rage. Rage was easy, fleeting, explosive, but hollow when the fire died down. What Marcus sought was something quieter, something more enduring. He began to type. I sat in seat 3A. I paid for it. I earned it. But in the eyes of those around me, I did not belong there. This is not new. This is not rare. It is the slow, grinding reality of living in a country that has always measured men like me in fractions, granting half the respect, half the dignity, and demanding twice the patience. Marcus's fingers moved faster, each word unfolding like a scar that had been waiting to break the surface. But I stayed seated that day not because I expected them to see me, but because I could not bear to disappear. The cursor hovered at the end of the sentence. But Marcus did not stop. I stayed seated because I am tired of shrinking. I am tired of walking away. I am tired of being polite in rooms where politeness is a shield that protects everyone but me. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The words felt heavier now that they had left him. But there was no regret in their weight. There was only truth. Marcus saved the draft, but he did not close it. He knew this was not finished. Because Marcus Bell understood something the airline's CEO, the flight attendants, and the supervisors had yet to realize. The apology was not the end. It was the beginning. And Marcus Bell wasn't done talking. Marcus Bell stood by the window, watching the city dissolve into dusk. The amber light stretched long across the skyline, casting shadows that crept along the rooftops and curled beneath the feet of those walking home. Marcus had always loved this hour, the quiet moment when the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between what had been and what was to come. But tonight, the quiet was different. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm. Marcus could feel it in the weight of the phone resting in his hand, in the steady hum of unread messages crowding his screen. The world, it seemed, had taken notice. It wasn't the apology that had stirred them. It was the thing beneath it. The thing people didn't like to name, the fire that smoldered quietly beneath the skin of this country, rising only when someone like Marcus refused to move, refused to bow beneath the weight of polite indifference. Marcus closed his eyes. He thought of his father's voice, the low timbre that had guided him through childhood like a compass. The thing about this country, his father once told him, is that it will let you die standing tall before it lets you live on your knees. And when you stand, Marcus, they will make sure you know how heavy the sky can be. His father was not a bitter man, but he was a man who understood the cost of keeping one's dignity intact. Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't David. It wasn't corporate. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Bell?" a woman's voice asked. It was soft, steady, the kind of voice that knew how to carry pain without breaking under it. "Yes, my name is Angela. I read about what happened." She paused. "My husband, he served Navy, like you. He's gone now, but I wanted to thank you." Marcus's throat tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Angela continued. "I know it's not much," she said quietly, "but I wanted to tell you that I saw you. And I told my grandson about you. I told him why you didn't get up from that seat." Marcus swallowed, pressing his fingers into the bridge of his nose. "Thank you," he said softly. Angela's voice lingered for a moment longer, and then the line went silent. Marcus lowered the phone, setting it on the windowsill. The world outside continued to move, cars threading through narrow streets, lights flickering on in distant apartments. And Marcus stood there, feeling something shift inside of him. It wasn't victory. It wasn't relief. It was something harder to name, something quieter but no less powerful. Angela's words echoed in his mind. "I saw you. Perhaps that was enough for tonight. But Marcus knew the morning would come. And with it, the questions. He would be asked by journalists, by executives, by strangers on the street what it was he wanted. Marcus didn't have an answer ready for them. But he knew this. He didn't want their apologies. He wanted their discomfort. He wanted them to feel the weight he carried, not for a moment, but for as long as it took for them to understand that the seat Marcus had paid for was not the thing they had tried to take from him. It was his place in the world. And Marcus Bell wasn't giving it up. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever.